Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fall Protection Advanced. This section of Fall Protection is in 3 parts. So this is part 1 of section 1, and we're going to go over concepts. So this training is, as it is titled, it is a little bit more advanced. We're going to go over in detail some things that you'll want to consider as a potential competent person on your job site. And you should have listened to the intro to this training where we talked about what a competent person is. As you see here in one of the sections, we're going to go over that in detail as well. But much of the training that you're going to get in this advanced training would qualify you as a competent person depending on what you're doing. And we will discuss that in more detail. As an FYI, we also have a more basic fall protection that covers your traditional ABCs of fall protection, things you need to look for when you're talking about wearing a harness and lanyard and inspections and things along those lines. So if you need that, take a look in our library of training, and we've got it, and that should help you out quite a bit. So what are we going to cover in section 1? Well, all of the things that you see here. So in part 1, we're going to cover fall prevention versus fall protection. You'll understand what the difference is and why we want to focus on fall prevention first if we can. Dynamics of a fall. What happens when you fall, and why are they so dangerous, and why is it one of the leading causes of death and fatalities and catastrophic injuries in the workplace? And duty to have fall protection. What are the legal requirements, when and where? In part 2, we'll go over guardrail systems, warning line systems, protection from falling objects, especially with guardrails and warning lines. We're going to go over a lot of myths and misconceptions that are out there. And with warning lines especially, there are a lot of different types of information that are rooted in truth, but there's some confusion. So hopefully we can clear that up and give you some food for thought. And in the third section, we're going to go over what you see here: holes and controlled access zones, CAS, safety monitors, training, and a few other items. So again, this is section 1, part 1 of advanced fall protection training. So as with anything, we have to ask the question, why? Why are we taking this training? And, for some of you, hopefully not many, but it may be, well, because, my boss told me to take this training. And, okay, fine. However, be aware that the why is always important. So even if your boss told you to take this training, or even if, as we'll talk about in a minute, there is a duty to provide this training because it's federal law. Or perhaps you're very interested in keeping yourself safe and your employees safe, or perhaps you've had a fall in the past and you don't want to recreate that. No matter your reason, hopefully you'll come into this training with an open mind, and you'll pick up some concepts that you haven't considered before that might allow you to keep yourself safe at height easier. A lot of times we, as human beings, when we have to take a training, and maybe we're not fully buying into it, which I hope you all are, but it's often because you're not seeing the applicability to the work that you're doing. You're not understanding, okay, well, that's great, but how does that apply for me? Or you're thinking, okay, well, that's great, but that'll never work with what I'm doing. And my hope is that with this training, you'll see enough options that we can cover most situations. Not all of them, but most 99% of the situations that are going to be out there. You could take the concepts that you're going to learn here and apply them and work to keep yourself and others safe. So what is the duty to have fall protection? What does the government, OSHA, among others, say that we have to do in order to have fall protection? Well, there are requirements that are contained in 1926 subpart M dash fall protection. So this 1926, this is construction. So this is the Code of Federal Regulations. You'll often see this with a 29 in front. So it'll say 29 CFR 1926 subpart M. Fall protection. Well, that just means that is the federal law if you are doing construction work. You'll also see 29 CFR 1910 subpart D, walking working surfaces. This 1910 means general industry, so that means most of the things that aren't construction. Now, there are other sections that would be related to agriculture or shipyard work and various other things, but most of what we're doing, if it's not construction, is general industry. Although there is a sizable portion of our workforce that does operate on shipyards and so on. There also is something that we're going to talk about in some detail in Section 2 that is called the ANSI Z359 Fall Protection Code. Originally, ANSI Z359 was for non-construction, but the ANSI committee, the group of subject matter experts, voted to include it for construction in 2015, unless there is a managed fall protection program in place, which would be something called ANSI A10. We're going to talk about that later. And this is what I was referencing before. There are fall protection requirements for shipyards and marine terminals and longshoring, as you see there. So before we go further, 2018 data. Now, this is being recorded in the beginning of 2020. Right now, 2019 data is not out. However, I can assure you that it's going to look something like this. 4,779 fatal work injuries in 2018. For the last however many years, at least 10 years, we've been somewhere around 5,000 fatal work injuries. That equates, in 2018, that equates to about 13 per day, which is one every other hour, give or take, which is fairly horrific if you think about it. It's just crazy. Fall, slips, or trip fatalities were 338 in just construction. In construction alone, so residential or commercial or renovation or similar, roughly one a day, maybe, not maybe, but just a little bit less than one person per day in the construction injury had a fatal slip, trip, or fall. It's just bananas. That's just crazy to think about. And that certainly doesn't even touch on the non-fatal yet debilitating injuries. And fall protection is the number one most frequently cited standard by OSHA. Why do you think that is? Well, it's because of everything you see here. This is what is going to have a devastating effect on the employee that falls. Falls are very expensive, and they can really, really cause mayhem personally for people and very much so disrupt businesses. So this link, we're not going to go into in this presentation, but this is just covering a lot of the data that I'm showing you there. So we have a duty to have fall protection. Federal government tells us that is the case. We also have, I would argue, a moral duty. I'm actually going to go back here. A moral duty, because we know that these statistics are very real. So the government tells us, yep, you need to have this, but we also, as business owners and as employees of these businesses, we also know the data is there. It's been year after year that these falls are dangerous. So that's a good why for me. So who falls? Well, falls resulted, if you look at those statistics that I just showed you, the falls resulted primarily from slippery surfaces, trips or loss of balance. Well, I don't think you need me to tell you that that's how you fall. I mean, that makes sense. But if you think about it, slippery surfaces for sure. Have you ever gotten on top of a commercial roof, a membrane roof, in the morning time in the summer, or really any time after it snows perhaps? But I know, speaking for myself, I certainly have transitioned from a ladder, maybe over a parapet, and then step on the roof. It's like ice, especially if it has algae or something on it, or there could even be ice on it. I personally have slipped and fallen into a couple of inches of water right on top of a roof, and not to mention that was in front of a lot of people, so a little embarrassing as well. But slippery surfaces are a common cause of falls in workplace. Trips and loss of balance, well, absolutely, especially if we have poor housekeeping. I can say this with some certainty that show me a job site that is not very clean and doesn't have good housekeeping, and I can show you a job site that's probably had a history of injuries or will have injuries, because housekeeping leads to injuries. It just does. It is causes trips, and it just is a good leading indicator, right? It's an indicator that happens ahead of the time. They tell us, hey, we might have some problems here. But housekeeping is another subject. Length of service has not been a significant factor. So the amount of time that employees have worked for the company hasn't been a significant factor per se, but training has been. So whether you've had training like this or not is a significant determinant whether or not you're going to have a significant fall. The average lost time due to a fall is 60 days. So 2 months average lost work time, which can be devastating, especially for smaller companies. Or often the folks that fall are the folks that and get injured and miss work are those that can least afford to miss work. And then if you're the employer, you have an average time out for 60 days. How are you going to replace that person? How are you going to replace their productivity? It's just devastating, and it's a ripple effect. 50% of all victims, whether it was a fatal fall or not, fell from ladders and scaffolds. So whether you are in construction or not, you likely use a ladder. And then, of course, scaffolds are mostly in construction. But folks fall from ladders and scaffolds all of the time. I can speak to this personally, both working as a consultant out in the field for various organizations, construction and not construction, working as a risk management consultant for an insurance company that only insure construction. Scaffold falls all the time, ladder falls all the time. It was constant. And then in working as a safety director for a large university, same thing. We would contract, we would have hundreds of millions of dollars in construction under contract, and we would bring trade partners and contractors in, and if they had an injury, it was usually a fall from a ladder, and to a lesser extent, a scaffold. So it certainly is something that happens, and we want to try to avoid. A little bit more information. So $15.5 billion per year is spent as a result of falls to a lower level, and $2.25 billion for slips and trips, which is a staggering amount of money. This is per Liberty Mutual. Most victims were not using fall protection or fall prevention methods. So, I don't mean to sound callous, but what did you expect? If you weren't making an effort to provide fall protection for yourself, or if you're responsible for others, or you weren't using the fall prevention methods we're going to use or understand here soon, then yeah, you're probably going to have a fall. It's just a matter of time. More accidents occur on a Monday than any other day, which I suppose there's quite a few reasons on that. If you go look at that data further, it's likely on a Monday in the fall. People up late watching football or something like that. But we won't get into that too much, but just an interesting statistic. And more accidents occur in the morning than any other time of day. So if you look at this, just this information here and here, what might be a good idea for a safety talk or a toolbox talk? Or when? Well, I'd say Monday morning, especially if you're going to have a new project starting, right? You want to have that toolbox talk and bring this up. Say, hey, more fall accidents occur on a Monday and a Monday morning than any other day. So let's be careful. Let's have our eyes open. So good idea for awareness and just, helping out your fellow employees. So where do we use fall protection? Common fall protection applications. So unprotected sides and edges. That usually means it's a roof, but it could also be something like a leading edge. So when we're constructing a building, hoist areas are notoriously dangerous. I've been on many projects and facilities, permanent facilities, where there might be guardrails and nice anchor points and everything. Looks great, and the hoist area is just wide open. So hoist areas are something we don't want to forget about. Holes, of course, we have to cover those. Formwork, ramps, runways, other walkways, excavations, certainly, especially if it's an excavation that's going to be tough to get out of if you fall in, even if you're not injured. Working over dangerous equipment, and ladders and scaffolds. Sorry, that should be another bullet point there. But ladders and scaffolds, as I mentioned, commonplace that we're going to use fall protection. So what are the physical effects on the body? Why are falls so dangerous? If you look here, We have a 1 foot fall. And let's pick a part of the body. So let's say we're going to use a head. So in 1/4 of a second, so let's say a second is 1,000. So that's a 1/4 of a second. You fall in 1 foot. The force on your head is 400 pounds. So you're falling at 8 feet per second. You're falling at about 5.5 miles per hour. That's 400. But look what happens when you've reached 0.75. So if this is 1,000, you have fallen 9 feet. You're at 24 feet per second. You're at 16 miles per hour. And you have 3,600 pounds of impact on your dome, on your head. This is why falls are so devastating. Right around here, right around half a second, that's when you realized you have fallen. Obviously at 0, you haven't fallen yet, but between 0 and half a second, that's about how long, half a second is about how long it takes to realize that you have fallen. And at that point, you're probably going to fall. You're probably not going to catch yourself. And at this point, the situation just compounds upon itself. So here's a 200-pound worker falling 6 feet. That equals about 9,000 pounds of energy. So a 6 foot fall is something that we commonly refer to as a long fall. So in this instance, we've got 9,216 pounds, so give or take. We'll just call it 9,000 pounds of energy. If you fall and hit your head, you're going to be injured at the very least. And the injury statistics and insurance claims are riddled with 6 foot falls, give or take, that have devastated lives. These falls are what we call never events. They simply can't happen. They are low frequency, high severity events. They don't happen often, but when they do, the severity and potential is very high. We have to constantly be vigilant against them in the workplace, do everything we can to prevent them. And if we can't prevent the potential for a fall, we're going to protect ourselves and those that we work with. So that should be all the why that you need. So what do? We need to plan our work. When we're working from heights, we have to plan projects to make sure the job's done safely. We have to decide how the job's going to be done, what tasks are going to be involved, what safety equipment do we need to complete the task, and is everyone trained on that? And we need to include any plan to have all of that equipment and tools available at the job site, whether it's a construction site or at a facility. It doesn't matter. It applies either way. We don't want to have a situation where we have a fall exposure and we don't have the equipment we need because we didn't do this first word. We didn't plan. You have to plan it ahead of time so that you can have the tools and the resources. So what to focus on? Now, again, if you've taken enough of our training here at Low Risk, we focus and harp on the hierarchy of controls constantly. It is something that we use every day. It is something that is easy to use and applies in almost all instances. And what is the hierarchy of control? So it's simple. It's what you see here. And take a thing that you have been exposed to that you couldn't solve. The thing being like a hazard, a workplace situation where you're thinking, we can't figure out a way to tie off, or I don't know. It could be almost anything. Go back and think about it in the context of using this hierarchy of control. So whenever someone comes to me and says, Trey, hey, we have this situation and we don't know what to do. Well, the first thing I'm going to ask is, do we have to do it at all? Can we eliminate that hazard? Can we physically remove the hazard? Another way to do that, if we're being a little callous isn't the word, but if we're looking to protect our organization, is something called transferring the risks. Can we transfer that risk to somebody else? So if you're not used to doing that work and your company's not used to doing that work, Can you contract it out to someone that is? That would be an example of eliminating the hazard. But let's say we can't do that. Let's say we can't eliminate it. That is the most effective. The next thing we're going to do is substitute. Can we replace the hazard with a less hazardous thing, whatever that might be? So this usually comes into play with chemicals, but there are other situations where it might apply. But if we can't eliminate it and we can't substitute, can we put a barrier? Can we use what's called an engineering control, where we isolate people from the hazard? What would be an example of an engineering control? A barrier when it comes to fall protection. A guardrail. That's an engineering control. That is not as effective as not being exposed to the hazard. Substitution doesn't apply, right? But next to elimination, that's the most effective. Next to that would be an administrative control. So that's where we change the way people work. An example of that would be a permit. So think of permits that you might use or that you've seen, right? So hot work permit, confined space entry permit, a permit required confined space, right? These are things where we're able to make sure that, in theory, people are following the procedures that we have set up and that they're trained and that they have the equipment. That goes back to our planning part, right? That goes back to here. We've planned it. So that's a good example of administrative control, because that ensures that we've done our due diligence. And then last but not least would be PPE, least effective. That's red. So PPE protects the worker with personal protective equipment. The problem is the hazard's still there. If we're talking about a fall, PPE for a fall would be a harness and a lanyard. Okay, that's great, but we haven't solved the problem that the fall still exists. It's still possible for you to fall. And then there are a host of things that better go right, or else you're going to get injured. So in reality, when we think of keeping people safe when it comes to falls, where do we go first? What's the first thing usually that people will go to? Here. They'll go to fall protection. Where's my anchor point? No, I want you to challenge yourself and say, all right, can we do any of these other things before we get to PPE? Because as we'll see here soon, there's a lot that has to go right, and you need to have enough room to fall and a variety of other things for this PPE to even work correctly. And it's often a false sense of security. So remember this hierarchy of controls and use it. And then we want to touch on a competent person. So a competent person is indeed the most important person on a job site or a facility safety-wise in many ways. However, a competent person is an employer designation. So I'll read this definition for you, and we're going to talk about it. But OSHA says it is one who is capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards in the surroundings or working conditions which are unsanitary, hazardous, or dangerous to employees, and who has authorization to take prompt corrective measures to eliminate them. Another definition OSHA has, and is one that I often use that's even easier, is that a person who is able to identify and predict hazard and has the authority to fix them. It is a performance-based term. That's the third bullet you see there. OSHA leaves latitude on how someone is determined to be competent, but they have to be effective and it must work. This can lead to a lot of confusion. So when regulations mandate a competent person, you'll see that in fall protection, in scaffolds, and excavations, and a million things with OSHA. It's the employer's obligation to determine the ability of that individual and designate them accordingly by their knowledge of the standards, right? So if we're talking construction, 1926 subpart M. If we're talking general industry, 1910 subpart D. So what is their knowledge? Do they know when you should have fall protection? Their experience at the task at hand and their ability to take corrective action. So keep in mind, authority can vary from having knowledge to make something safe to simply not allowing work to be performed. It's essential that a competent person operate within an overall system that is guided by the employer and based on anticipated hazards and employee vulnerabilities. So, a takeaway from this, you will often see competent person training. And while it is that, know that you can be competent in one situation and not competent in another. In many ways, this training, depending on what you're doing, could be considered competent person training. But I don't like to title it that because competent person is an employer designation. You as an employer or you as an employee of an employer need to understand that it's up to you to determine whether or not the competent person on that job site is capable of identifying those hazards and predicting those hazards and can take prompt corrective measures. That's what makes it competent person. The training is part of that, but it depends. Let's say you are just going to do a simple operation where you're going to go in an exposed area and you're going to, and it's very straightforward, and there's a nice anchor point, and it's very easy to do. Well, the amount of training for you to do that is much less than training that might be required to climb a cell tower, for example. I've taught OSHA 30 classes to companies that construct cell towers, and fall protection is always interesting because I'm not a competent person for cell tower fall protection measures, right? I mean, it makes sense. That's a very specialized thing. So you could come to me and I hire you to teach. You hire me to teach competent person fall protection, and I do, and I teach you what I'm teaching now. But you're constructing cell towers. Well, I'm doing you a disservice. So I guess my point with this is to be careful and understand that competent person is what the employer designates. It is an employer designation. And that employer needs to think, okay, does this person have enough training given the hazards that we have? And can they identify and predict hazards? Do we trust them that they know how to do that, and can they fix them? That's what makes you a competent person. So keep that in mind. So this is a busy slide, but I do like to include it. I'm going to touch on it a little bit. So what are some competent person considerations when we're talking for fall protection? So what is the competent person's experience? Look at these things. Time on site. How long have they been at the trade? Time working at heights. What are their life experiences? Lessons from previous falls. How about knowledge? Have they had any OSHA authorized basic fall protection training? Well, you hope so. Have they had manufacturer training? Manufacturers reps come out all the time and provide training. Well, that's a good thing to know. Of course, you want to have that in your training record. Task-specific knowledge. Do they understand guardrails and control access? All of these things here. Do they understand basic math to identify if there's enough fall distance? What about suspension trauma and understanding the science behind blood pooling, which we'll talk about later if you happen to fall? Do they have authority? All of these things here. Are they an apprentice or a journeyman or a master? Do they have respect of their fellow employees? What about management skills and credibility? What about training on the personal fall arrest system? Do they know how to identify if a tie-off structure has integrity? What about intelligence, demeanor, and then integrity of the person themselves? And then when we're thinking about competent persons, how about administration? So do they know how to enforce the fall protection program, understand equipment maintenance, everything you see here, communication? Are they available? Are they often on the job site? Can they transfer their knowledge and train the workers, right? So all of these things come into play when we're talking a competent person. Sometimes you need every single one of them. Most of the time you don't. You need a few. So keep that in mind as competent person training, or as you designate a competent person, and also keep that in mind when you go take a competent person training, whatever the subject is. Just because you take that training doesn't automatically make you competent. What it automatically does is give you knowledge that you have the potential to be a competent person, depending on the hazards and the job site. So keep that in mind if you would. So that is the end. I got ahead of myself on the slide, but that's okay. They're interchangeable. That is the end of part 1 of section 1. So we've covered some really basic concepts, and then in part 2, we're going to go into some fall prevention methods. We're not even going to talk about harnesses and lanyards for a little while yet. We're going to talk about prevention methods for you to keep yourself and your coworkers from even having to worry about a fall in the first place. Thanks, and see you on the next one.